The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a chain of routes linking China with Central Asia and later with lands farther west. Its history matters because it shows how exchange became more regular over time through contact, expansion, and practical necessity. Early Chinese records already mention goods, envoys, and distant peoples beyond the imperial frontier. As Chinese dynasties and Central Asian powers grew stronger, those contacts became easier to sustain. What began as intermittent exchange gradually turned into a network that moved silk, horses, ideas, and political influence across Eurasia. Before the Silk Road became a famous phrase, Central Asia already had the geography that made long-distance exchange possible. The region was broken by deserts, dry basins, mountain passes, and scattered river valleys, so movement rarely followed a straight line. Travelers moved where water was available, where animals could rest, and where weather and terrain made passage possible. The earliest overland routes were therefore not a single road, but repeated practical choices made over many generations. The most important of those choices led through oases. A caravan could not cross open desert without stopping. It needed wells, pasture, grain, and shelter. For that reason, settlements at the edge of the Taklamakan and along the margins of the Central Asian steppes became more than local towns. They were resting points between larger worlds. Some remained small communities, while others grew into fortified cities or regional centers under local rulers. Their value came from geography as much as from politics. Whoever controlled water and the approach roads could influence the movement of goods. Later, this would become a major source of power for oasis elites, but the pattern was already visible much earlier, when access to a reliable stop could determine whether a journey was possible at all. This system existed long before any one empire claimed the whole region. Bronze Age and early Iron Age communities in and around Central Asia exchanged metalwork, textiles, livestock, and prestige items across considerable distances. Archaeology shows that objects moved even when formal states were weak or absent. Beads, ornaments, and foreign-style goods found in burial sites and settlements suggest contact across steppe zones and through mountain corridors. That does not mean there was one continuous trade route linking east and west from the beginning. It means that local exchanges taken together formed a wider chain. A trader or messenger would usually move from one known center to the next, handing off cargo, news, or diplomatic gifts along the way. Much of this movement was probably seasonal and opportunistic, shaped by pasture conditions and the availability of escorts or companions rather than by fixed schedules. Distance remained the central problem. Goods that could survive travel were often light, valuable, and portable. Heavy cargo was harder to justify because every extra load meant more animals, more water, and more risk. That is one reason luxury goods became so important in early transcontinental exchange. Silk, precious stones, metal objects, and fine textiles were easier to move than bulk grain or timber. Even before imperial governments took a stronger interest, merchants and local rulers understood that the route worked best when the cargo was valuable enough to repay the difficulty of the journey. In practice, this also encouraged exchange in small consignments, passing through many hands before reaching a distant buyer. The value of the route lay not in carrying everything, but in carrying the few things that could absorb the cost of travel. The landscape also encouraged layered movement. One route might run along a river valley, then turn toward a pass, then descend to another oasis where it would meet a different set of traders. In some places, routes crossed the edges of the steppe. In others, they hugged cultivated land. The result was a patchwork of connections rather than a single highway. This mattered because it made Central Asia both a corridor and a barrier. It allowed exchange, but only for people willing to adapt to broken terrain, seasonal conditions, and local authority. The network could expand or contract depending on rainfall, conflict, and the strength of nearby communities. A route that was useful one generation might become unsafe or less profitable in the next, then recover later if a settlement revived or a pass became more secure. By the time Chinese states began paying closer attention to the western frontier, these older paths were already in place. The Han dynasty began to look westward when the Chinese court made the western regions a matter of state policy. The lands beyond the empire were not unknown, but they had long been known only in fragments. Under the Han, they became important for practical reasons: horses, security, diplomacy, and trade. Once those concerns came together, the western frontier was no longer just a distant edge. It became a place where policy had to be made. Horses were one of the first motives. Han rulers needed strong cavalry mounts, especially for the defense of the northwestern frontier and for the wider struggle with steppe rivals. Chinese sources later spoke of the heavenly horses of Fergana, and that tradition became famous, but the surviving accounts should be read carefully because they mix admiration with court politics and diplomacy. Even so, the basic need is clear. The Han wanted better horses than they could easily raise in the settled core of China, and the western routes offered access to them. In this setting, horses were not a luxury. They were a military requirement. Trade also pulled the Han court westward. Silk already had value in exchange with peoples outside the empire, and the Chinese elite wanted goods that could not be produced at home. But trade along these routes did not depend on demand alone. It depended on whether the frontier was secure, whether local rulers cooperated, and whether the surrounding steppe was controlled or contested. Commerce and defense were tied together. A safer frontier made regular exchange more possible, and regular exchange gave the frontier more importance. The same roads that could carry merchants could also carry envoys, intelligence, and military movement. This was especially true under Emperor Wu, whose reign in the 2nd century BCE marked a major expansion of Han power. His government pushed deeper into the northwest as part of a broader struggle with the Xiongnu and other frontier powers that could threaten the empire's borders and disrupt movement across Inner Asia. The campaign was not motivated by trade alone. It was also an effort to reduce danger, extend influence, and make the Western approaches more manageable. Warfare, alliance-making, and administration all became part of that effort. As Han power moved outward, the court began to treat the far western regions less as unknown margins and more as places that could be reached, assessed, and influenced. The scale of that effort matters. Emperor Wu's government was not simply sending occasional expeditions. It was building an approach to the frontier that linked military campaigns with mapped knowledge and formal contacts. Military commanders, court officials, and frontier administrators all had roles in the process, and the state invested heavily in holding strategic corridors along the Hexi region, the long strip of land that connected China proper to the Oases farther west. Control there was not complete or permanent, but even partial control changed what was possible. It gave the Han a way to move men, messages, and supplies farther from the central plain. Diplomacy became one of the main tools for doing that. The Han sent envoys west, sometimes with little success and sometimes at considerable risk. The most famous among them was Qian, whose journeys belong to the next stage of the story. Even before his reports became influential, however, the court was already trying to establish contact beyond the immediate frontier. These missions had concrete purposes. They were meant to find allies, learn about rivals, and gather information about the lands beyond the deserts and mountain passes. In a region where movement depended on local cooperation, information itself became a form of power. Zhang Qian's importance was not only that he traveled far, but that he helped the Han court think in broader geographic terms. Later historical writing presents him as someone who brought back knowledge of distant kingdoms, including the places the Chinese identified as Dayuan, Daxia, and others in Central Asia. The exact details in later retellings vary, and some descriptions reflect Chinese categories more than local realities, but the larger effect is well attested. The court gained a better sense that the world beyond the frontier was not a single empty space. It was a chain of states, oases, and intermediaries, each with its own interests. That understanding made diplomacy more systematic. Military pressure and diplomacy worked together. The Han could not simply decree control over the western routes. It had to advance gradually, establish a presence where it could, negotiate where it had to, and use force when conditions demanded it. In some places, this meant garrisons or protected commanderies near the edge of cultivation. In others, it meant dealing with local rulers who still held real authority and had to be treated as partners, clients, or opponents. The result was not a single fixed border, but a widening zone of Han influence moving toward the Tarim Basin and the broader Central Asian world. That expansion changed the meaning of the Western roads. Before this period, they were useful but fragmented, shaped mainly by local needs. Under Han interest and Han pressure, they became part of a larger imperial strategy. The court never controlled the whole network, and it never fully would, but it now had reasons to care about the spaces between oases, mountain passes, and caravan stops. Each mission, each outpost, and each attempt to secure horses or allies made the Western corridor more legible to Chinese officials. Even failures could produce knowledge. A failed embassy still taught the court which routes were viable, which rulers were open to negotiation, and where travel became difficult. There was also a human cost to this growing reach, though the surviving record usually emphasizes state results more than individual experience. Envoys could be detained, escorts could be lost, supplies had to be carried across difficult country, and each stage depended on water, grazing, and the willingness of local communities to cooperate. The best-known figure in the early history of the Silk Road is Zhang Qian, a Han envoy whose travels gave Chinese writers a much clearer picture of the lands to the west. His first mission began around 138 BCE, when Emperor Wu sent him north and west in search of the Yuezhi, whom the Han hoped might help against the Xiongnu. The mission did not proceed as planned. Qian was captured and held for years by the Xiongnu before he escaped and continued westward. By the time he reached regions beyond the Tarim Basin, he had entered a world Han officials knew only in fragments, through rumor, trade goods, and frontier reports. His importance came from what he brought back. Qian described countries such as Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, Daxia in Bactria, and other states farther west. He reported settled agriculture, urban life, and established rulers. He also noted that these lands valued strong horses, traded actively, and were connected to wider regional systems rather than isolated at the edge of the world. Some later Chinese accounts preserve details about routes, distances, and local products. Not every detail can be treated as direct fact, since the material passed through imperial record-keeping and later compilation, but the broader effect is clear. The West was no longer only a vague direction. It now had names, political structures, and economic possibilities that mattered because the Han court wanted practical leverage. The empire needed horses for cavalry and frontier defense, especially the famous horses of Fergana, which later Chinese sources treated as especially valuable. It also wanted allies, or at least a better understanding of the powers beyond its borders. Zhang Qian's mission did not create trade by itself, and it did not produce immediate diplomacy with every kingdom he described. But it changed the quality of Chinese knowledge. Officials could distinguish one Western region from another. They could think in terms of routes, rulers, and exchanges instead of only distant and uncertain lands. That kind of knowledge often makes regular contact possible. The Han state then acted on that information. Imperial attention to the western regions increased, and later campaigns pushed Chinese influence farther toward the Tarim Basin. Zhang Qian does not explain all of that change, but he helped make it possible by showing that the journey west was not a single impossible leap. It was a chain of contacts. One oasis led to another. One polity could be reached through another. Goods, envoys, and messages could move if there were enough reasons and enough protection. His return also gave the court a more usable sense of geography. Instead of imagining the western frontier as a blank edge, Han officials could begin to picture a connected zone of settled kingdoms and caravan routes. In a frontier empire, that distinction mattered. A place that could be described could be approached. A route that could be repeated could be administered. Even if the information was incomplete, it made policy more informed. The Han did not need perfect knowledge to act. They needed enough knowledge to test a plan, send another envoy, or support a military expedition when the opportunity arose. Zhang Qian's reports also helped later writers place the western regions on a larger historical map. The accounts associated with him, especially those preserved in Sima Qian's historical tradition and in later dynastic histories, became one of the main Chinese windows onto Central Asia. His importance was therefore not limited to his own lifetime. He became a reference point for later generations trying to understand what lay beyond the frontier. In that sense, his journeys were both diplomatic and archival. They expanded the court's reach, and they expanded its memory. They did not turn Central Asia into a Chinese province, and they did not make the terrain easier. Once the Han court understood the western routes more clearly, the next problem was no longer knowledge. It was administration. A road that carried goods and messengers across deserts and passes also needed rules, guards, stations, and officials who could keep it usable from season to season. In practice, that meant the Han frontier became less like a hard edge and more like a managed zone. The empire did not control every mile of the journey, but it tried to control the points that mattered most. One part of that system was military. Garrisons were placed in strategic locations to defend approaches, watch movement, and respond to raids or unrest. These posts were not there because the Han could turn the entire western landscape into settled farmland. Most of that terrain remained too dry, too distant, or too politically fragmented for that. But the state could hold certain corridors, especially where routes narrowed through oasis chains, or where movement had to pass between mountains and desert. A garrison at the right place could make a long stretch of road safer for merchants and envoys. It could also signal that the Han presence in the region was real, not just symbolic. In a frontier world, that mattered. A visible military post could discourage opportunistic attacks, reassure allied communities, and remind local rulers that the empire was willing to spend manpower to keep the route open. Another part was diplomatic and administrative. The Han did not govern the western regions in the same way it governed the core provinces around the Yellow River. Instead, it relied on a layered system of protectorates, local alliances, and appointed officials who handled frontier affairs. Later Chinese sources described the Western Region's Protectorate as an important institution for managing relations with the Tarim Basin, though its exact reach and stability changed over time. That kind of arrangement shows how frontier rule often worked in the ancient world. An empire did not always need direct settlement to shape a route. It could use tribute, hostages, agreements, and local intermediaries to keep the road open enough for its purposes. In practice, this meant dealing with smaller kingdoms and oasis leaders one by one, because the political map of the region was not uniform. Some places could be drawn into Han influence more easily than others, and some could switch loyalties when the balance of power changed. Relay stations were equally important. These posts supported travel by providing fresh horses, supplies, and rest for official messengers. In Chinese statecraft, relay systems had long been tied to communication, but on the western frontier they became especially useful because distance itself was one of the main obstacles. A message from the capital to the edge of Central Asia could not move in a single push. It had to pass from one station to the next, often through terrain where water and fodder were limited. Relay stations reduced that burden. They also tied the western routes more closely to imperial time. If a road can carry news more reliably, then the state can respond more quickly, and that changes the value of the road itself. A quicker reply could mean faster military coordination, better coordination with allies, or simpler supervision of remote officials. Even when the empire could not travel everywhere at once, it could still make the road work for administration. This frontier system did not remove danger. It reduced uncertainty in some places and increased it in others. Some routes were protected only as long as the local political balance held. When alliances shifted, when a garrison was weakened, or when neighboring powers pressed in, the same road could become difficult again. That instability is part of the story. The Silk Road was never a single secure highway. It was a patchwork of segments, each dependent on local conditions. The Han contribution was to make more of those segments legible to the state and, when possible, to place them under some form of supervision. Even then, the system depended on regular attention. A station left understocked, a frontier commander replaced, or a local ally lost to a rival could change the safety of a route within a short time. That supervision mattered because the western roads were not empty passages. They ran through inhabited borderlands, where oasis communities, pastoral groups, and local rulers all had their own interests. A station, a fortress, or an official post could protect travel, but it also affected tax collection, diplomacy, and the movement of soldiers. The frontier was therefore both commercial and political. Trade followed the same routes that armies and diplomats used, and once the Han state invested in those routes, the roads became part of imperial strategy. The value of silk, horses, and information made the routes worth defending, but the routes also served larger goals: frontier security, prestige, and influence over neighbors. Horses were especially important in this setting because the Han needed strong mounts for cavalry and border defense, while Western regions often valued Chinese silk as a high-status good. The exchange helped make the system worthwhile on both sides, even when the costs of maintaining it were high. Over time, this created a pattern that would recur again and again in Silk Road history. Empires did not fully create the road, but they could stabilize it in certain regions. They could sponsor the posts that made travel possible, appoint officials to watch over movement, and claim authority over the narrow places where geography concentrated traffic. The result was not a neat borderline. It was a managed frontier, full of negotiation and compromise, where imperial power met local reality. The Han state could not erase the independence of distant communities, and it did not try to. Instead, it built a workable framework around them, one that allowed movement without requiring full conquest. That was a practical solution, and for a time it gave the western routes a degree of order that they had not had before. By the end of the Han period, the western roads were no longer just caravan paths used by merchants moving between distant communities. If the Han frontier system gave the western routes a measure of order, the Tarim Basin gave them a geography. Between the great deserts of Central Asia, travel did not move in a single open line. It moved from one oasis to the next, because those were the places where water, fields, and settlements could survive. The Silk Road depended on a chain of small kingdoms and city-states around the edges of the Taklamakan Desert. Without them, long-distance travel would have been far more difficult. With them, caravans could rest, resupply, and continue. The basin itself was harsh, the Taklamakan, with its shifting sands and extreme conditions, made direct crossing dangerous, so routes usually followed the northern and southern edges of the desert. Along both sides, oasis towns developed where rivers, springs, or underground water could support agriculture. These places grew crops, maintained local markets, and collected taxes or tolls under their own rulers. Some were large enough to matter in regional politics. Others were smaller but still essential, because they marked the intervals between harder stretches of travel. They were not just stops on a map. They were the infrastructure that made the map usable. Many of these oasis kingdoms are known mainly from Chinese historical sources, especially accounts from the Han period and later. Some are clearer in the record than others, and scholars still rely on written sources, archaeology, and later traditions to reconstruct their history. What emerges is a region of local rulers balancing different pressures. They dealt with larger powers to the east and west. They managed water and land in difficult conditions. And they positioned themselves along routes that brought merchants, envoys, and news through their cities. That combination gave them leverage even when they were vulnerable. This is one reason the Silk Road cannot be understood only as an imperial project. The empires mattered, but the daily functioning of the road depended on smaller political communities that controlled the narrow points where movement was possible. A caravan might pass through many hands before it reached a major capital. The goods it carried were often light and valuable precisely because transport was slow and expensive. A city that could host travelers, protect storage, and maintain access to water could earn a place in the larger economy. Over time, that made the oasis world more settled and more interconnected. The Tarim Basin also formed a kind of relay system. No single kingdom controlled the whole route, and that fragmentation could be inconvenient for travelers, but it also created multiple points of exchange. A merchant did not need one unified empire to move from east to west. What was needed was a sequence of local arrangements: safe passage here, supplies there, a market, a guide, a translator, a tax payment, a rest stop. In that sense, the oasis cities were not passive background. They were active participants in the circulation of people and goods. They linked regions that otherwise would have remained much more distant from one another. Over time, some of these places became known well beyond their immediate valleys. Khotan, on the southern edge of the basin, grew into an important center in both commerce and religion. Kashgar, farther west, stood near the point where routes could continue toward Central Asia. Kucha, on the northern side, was another major oasis city, remembered in Chinese sources for its strategic position and its place in wider cultural exchange. Each of these communities was shaped by the same basic problem: how to survive in a desert environment while also benefiting from movement passing through it. Their answer was to tie water management, agriculture, taxation, and hospitality together into a durable local system. That system depended on labor as much as on geography. Canals had to be maintained, fields had to be irrigated, and storage had to be organized so that grain and other supplies could carry travelers through seasons when conditions worsened. Caravans did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived in places where people had already made the land productive enough to support both local life and outside traffic. In return, the traffic brought silver, textiles, ideas, and diplomatic messages. Even when trade was uneven, the presence of that traffic gave oasis rulers an incentive to keep roads open and to preserve a reputation for reliability. Archaeological evidence has helped confirm how important this network was. Ruins, manuscripts, and material remains from sites around the basin show a world of layered influence, with Chinese, Indian, Iranian, and local traditions visible in different periods. That does not mean the oasis cities lost their own identity. It means they sat at a meeting point where languages, beliefs, and commercial habits crossed and mixed. Once those routes existed, the question was what actually moved along them, and why anyone would accept the cost of sending goods so far. The answer was not ordinary bulk trade. Across much of the Silk Road, transport was slow, fragile, and expensive, so the most common cargoes were small, valuable, and easy to move. A caravan could carry only what justified the effort. Silk became the best known of these goods, especially because it was light, portable, and already tied to status in China. Chinese silk traveled west in small quantities rather than as everyday cloth, and its rarity made it desirable in distant markets. In return, China sought goods it could not easily produce in its own core farming regions. Horses were among the most important. The Han court valued strong horses from Central Asia for military use and prestige. Good horses strengthened cavalry and frontier defense, giving them a strategic value far beyond their market price. In some periods, the court's need for horses shaped diplomacy and frontier policy as much as trade itself. Jade also had long significance in China, and some jade moved through Western networks, though not always in large quantities. Other prized goods included precious stones, aromatic substances, and spices from farther south and west. Metals traveled too, especially in refined or finished forms. A worked object could be easier to transport than a raw commodity because it packed value into a small space. Glass is a clear example. Roman glass, or glass made through technologies associated with the Mediterranean world, has been found at sites far to the east, showing that even fragile goods could travel when they were valuable enough and carefully handled. Such finds do not mean one object crossed every hand in a single trip, but they do show that materials and techniques moved across the wider network. Similar evidence appears in beads, metal fittings, and ornamental pieces that survive more often than ordinary goods because valuable objects were also more likely to be preserved in tombs and caches. This exchange worked through comparison. Different regions wanted different things, and they did not all value the same goods in the same way. One place prized silk as a mark of refinement, another valued horses because of war and transport. Another wanted spices, incense, or metalware because of taste, ritual, or status. The routes linked these preferences together. Goods did not simply move from source to destination and stop there. They often changed hands many times, with each middleman taking a share for transport risk or local tax. That made the system less direct than a modern map might suggest, but also more durable because many communities could profit at each stage. It also meant prices rose as goods traveled, which is one reason only compact, high-value items tended to make the longest journeys. There is also an important distinction between what was most famous and what was most common. Silk is remembered because it gave the network its modern name, but the road was not sustained by silk alone. Everyday movement included modest loads of wool, leather, grain, salt, ceramics, tools, and livestock products, depending on region and season. These less celebrated goods matter because they show that the Silk Road was not only a chain of luxury exchange. It also supplied travelers, settlements, and frontier communities that could not survive on prestige items alone. Even so, the goods that drew the widest attention were the high-value ones because they could cross the greatest distances and create visible connections between distant courts and markets. A ruler might receive a bolt of silk as tribute or diplomacy. A merchant might carry luxury objects as part of a broader consignment. A temple might acquire incense, manuscripts, or ornament. These small cargoes made the routes profitable, and their rarity made the route itself seem remarkable. Over time, repeated exchanges created recognizable patterns. China exported silk and sometimes lacquerware or other crafted goods. Central Asian intermediaries moved horses, textiles, and information. India contributed spices, cotton goods, gems, and religious materials in some contexts. Western regions sent glass, metal goods, wine in certain periods, and other items shaped by their own economies. The exact mix changed from place to place and century to century, but the larger pattern stayed the same. The road connected regions with different resources, different tastes, and different forms of wealth. Some goods also carried ideas along with them, not in a formal way, but through the people who used, sold, or requested them. A textile pattern, a decorative style, or a preferred material could travel because it suited a court, a workshop, or a religious community at the far end of the route. The Silk Road depended on merchants and middlemen, not just emperors and armies. Among the most important were the Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people of Central Asia, with towns and farming communities around places such as Samarkand and Bukhara. By late antiquity and the early medieval period, Sogdian merchants were traveling widely along the routes between China, the Tarim Basin oasis towns, and regions farther west. Their influence did not come from conquest. It came from a practical skill that mattered everywhere on the route. They could move between languages, customs, and commercial practices that changed from one place to the next. That ability mattered because long-distance trade rarely worked as a direct exchange between two distant points. A shipment of silk, spices, glass, or documents usually passed through several hands before it reached its final market. Each transfer required trust. Merchants needed partners who could store goods, extend credit, settle accounts, and pass messages along. In that setting, language was not just conversation. It was a commercial tool. A trader who could speak with local rulers, caravan leaders, temple communities, and foreign buyers had a clear advantage in a world where laws and customs differed from one oasis or court to another. Sogdian traders appear in Chinese sources, in Central Asian inscriptions, and in documents preserved along the dry routes of the Silk Road. Some of the best evidence comes from letters, receipts, contracts, and related papers found at desert sites, where the climate helped preserve materials that would normally have decayed. These records showed trade as a series of ordinary arrangements. Goods were sent, stored, reassigned, taxed, and sometimes delayed. Families and business partners could be spread across several towns. One merchant might travel ahead with a caravan while another managed accounts at home, and relatives or associates kept the chain of trust intact. The system still involved risk, but it made repeated exchange possible. The documents also show that trade was often slower and more fragile than later legends suggest. Caravans had to wait for seasons, negotiate safe passage, and adjust to the demands of local authorities. A delivery could be interrupted by weather, banditry, or a change in political control. Merchants responded by diversifying routes and by keeping relationships alive in more than one place. If one crossing became unusable, another might still remain open. In practice, the Silk Road was less a single road than a web of alternatives, and middlemen were the people who knew how to move through it. The Sogdians were not the only people who filled this role. Other Central Asian groups also served as translators, guides, carriers, and intermediaries. Different communities controlled different stretches at different times. Some managed mountain passes, some handled oasis towns, some negotiated with steppe rulers or Chinese officials. What linked them was not a single state, but a shared position in the network. They lived in the spaces between larger political powers, and those spaces often became the most important parts of the route. This is why the Silk Road should not be imagined as one long road running cleanly from China to Rome. It worked more like a chain of connected exchanges. One merchant might deal only with a single desert crossing. Another might specialize in horses, textiles, or written messages between two familiar markets. The system functioned because each segment was managed by people who knew that segment well. Local knowledge mattered as much as distance. Traders had to know where water could be found, which authorities collected duties, which rulers were stable, and which towns were reliable places to stay overnight. Merchants also carried information, and that information could be as valuable as cargo. News about prices, political change, military danger, and court preferences moved alongside the physical goods. If a frontier became unstable, traders often learned it quickly. If a city's elite began to favor a foreign textile or a particular kind of glass, that preference could spread through commercial contacts. Merchants did not simply react to demand. They helped shape it by learning what sold, where it sold, and how buyers expected it to be presented. In that sense, they linked markets before there were modern markets, making distant regions more aware of one another than they had been before. Credit was another part of the same system. Because the routes were long, traders did not usually move all their wealth in cash or carry every valuable item themselves. They relied on loans, deposits, partnerships, and obligations spread across multiple places. The exact forms varied from region to region, and the surviving records are uneven, but the underlying idea was consistent. Trade needed ways to move value without moving every coin or object at once. That made merchant communities important in a deeper sense. They were not only transporters, they were administrators of confidence. If a partner in one town trusted that another partner elsewhere would honor a debt or deliver a shipment, commerce could continue across enormous distances. In some oasis cities, merchant families became long-term residents, maintaining warehouses and hosting travelers. In other cases, they stayed highly mobile, shifting routes as conditions changed. Either way, they benefited from the fact that the Silk Road was not controlled entirely from above. Empires could secure roads, collect taxes, and send missions, but they could not replace the daily labor of the merchants who made exchange routine. The road needed state power, but it also needed private networks. Once merchants had made the routes dependable enough for regular exchange, ideas could travel with them, though not in a simple or direct way. Religions moved through the Silk Road along the same practical channels as goods, and they changed as they went. Monks, pilgrims, translators, patrons, and merchant families all helped carry them, but so did prisoners, refugees, diplomats, and people living in the borderlands between larger states. What arrived in a new region was rarely unchanged. Local languages, political conditions, and older traditions shaped how a faith was received, taught, and practiced. Buddhism was the clearest early example. It began in northern India, but by the centuries around the start of the Common Era, it was moving steadily across Central Asia. Some of the strongest evidence comes from surviving manuscripts, inscriptions, monastery remains, and art from oasis sites along the Tarim Basin. These sources show Buddhist communities in places such as Kucha, Khotan, and Dunhuang, where merchants and rulers could support monasteries, sponsor translations, and commission religious art. Buddhism was not carried by one route alone. It moved through multiple languages and multiple forms, including Indian, Iranian, and later Chinese traditions. As it traveled, it became more varied, not less. Monasteries along the road also did practical work. They preserved texts, offered lodging, and served as stable institutions in regions where movement could be difficult. In some oasis towns, they also linked local rulers to wider networks of prestige. A donation to a religious house was not only an act of belief, it could also signal rank, learning, or protection of a valuable international community. Chinese records help show how this process unfolded from the eastern side. By the later Han period, and after, Buddhism was no longer entirely foreign to Chinese observers. Translators worked to render Indian terms into Chinese, often with imperfect results at first. That difficulty matters because it shows how transmission actually worked. Ideas were not simply copied from one place to another. They had to be explained, compared, and adapted. Early Chinese Buddhist texts sometimes used familiar words from Taoist or classical traditions to make new concepts understandable, and that choice affected how Buddhism developed in China. Over time, Buddhist schools became deeply rooted in Chinese society, but only after a long process of adjustment. Translation itself became a major scholarly field, especially under patronage from rulers and elite families who wanted access to the new teaching. Large projects required trained teams, reliable texts, and institutions able to sustain them over time. Other religions followed similar paths, though their histories on the Silk Road were less widespread or less durable in some regions. Manichaeism, founded in 3rd century Persia by Mani, spread across Central Asia through merchant and missionary activity. Surviving texts and artistic fragments from later centuries show that it found support among some Turkic and Sogdian communities. It remained a minority tradition, but it shows how the road could carry a faith far from its place of origin. Its teachers relied on portable texts and organized communities, which suited long-distance movement. Like Buddhism, it had to be translated into local settings, and like Buddhism, it encountered rulers who sometimes protected it and sometimes restricted it. Because Manichaeism emphasized written teaching and a disciplined community structure, it could be carried by educated believers moving with trade networks. That helped it survive for a time in places where direct contact with its Persian origins was limited. The history of Christianity along the Silk Road is more fragmentary, but it is still important. The tradition often called Nestorian Christianity in older scholarship was part of the Church of the East, centered in the Persian world. It spread eastward into Central Asia and eventually into China, where the Qian stele of 781 records the presence of a Christian community and describes the arrival of the faith in the Tang period. That inscription is contemporary evidence for a real and organized community. Even though later retellings sometimes simplify the story, it shows that the Silk Road was not only a route for one religion moving outward from one center, it was a corridor in which several traditions lived beside one another, sometimes competing, sometimes borrowing methods, and often adapting to the same multilingual world. The stele also suggests how carefully such communities presented themselves. It frames Christian teaching in terms that Tang officials and educated readers could understand, which is another reminder that survival depended not just on arrival, but on intelligible presentation. Zoroastrian, Jewish, and other communities also traveled through these networks, especially in merchant diasporas and urban centers, though their visibility in the surviving record varies by region and period. Some beliefs spread because merchants carried them deliberately. Others spread because people who already followed them settled in new places and established households, temples, and burial customs. The road made room for continuity at a distance. A community did not need to disappear from its homeland in order to take root elsewhere. In some cities, these communities appear mainly in burial evidence, personal names, or references in administrative documents. That smaller footprint can make them harder to trace, but it also reflects the everyday nature of their movement. Families migrated, married locally, and retained selected customs rather than reproducing every feature of their original culture. What made this possible was not only movement, but translation in the broadest sense. A text had to be copied in a new script. A teacher had to explain a ritual in another language. A patron had to decide whether a foreign monastery or church could be supported in a local city. In some cases, scholars can trace the process through manuscript caches and bilingual inscriptions. In others, the evidence is thinner, and historians have to be cautious. But the pattern is clear enough. Religious exchange followed the same structural logic as commercial exchange. It depended on intermediaries, trust, and repetition. On the western end of the Silk Road, no power shaped trade more consistently than Parthia. The Parthian Empire rose in Iran in the last centuries before the Common Era and controlled a wide region between Mesopotamia and the eastern deserts. That position gave it leverage. Goods moving between China, Central Asia, India, and the Mediterranean often passed through territory. Parthian rulers could tax, protect, redirect, or interrupt. They did not control every route at every moment, but their place in the system made them important middlemen in the exchange between East and West. This mattered because silk had become one of the most desired goods moving across Eurasia. In China, silk had long been used for clothing, ritual, and display. By the time long-distance exchange intensified, it was already tied to refinement and status. Farther west, it was prized for different reasons. Roman writers knew it as an exotic fabric from a distant and little understood land. Some admired it, some criticized it as a luxury that encouraged excess. But criticism did not reduce demand. Silk remained scarce in the Roman world, and scarcity made it more desirable. It was light, easy to carry, and expensive enough that small shipments could hold great value. that made it well suited to a route system built on chains of exchange rather than direct movement from one end to the other. Rome did not control the overland route that brought silk westward. Instead, Roman demand created the market, and that market shaped the behavior of traders far from Rome itself. Imports reached the Mediterranean through several hands. Some moved through Central Asia, some passed through Iranian and Mesopotamian intermediaries, some may have crossed Indian Ocean routes and then moved inland again. The exact path varied by period and political conditions. What stayed constant was the desire of Roman elites for Eastern luxuries and the willingness of merchants and middlemen to supply them when conditions allowed. Roman moral criticism often treated silk as a sign of softness or waste, but that criticism also shows how visible the material had become in elite life. Even when cloth arrived in limited quantities, it was enough to enter debate and display. Parthia benefited from being in the middle. Control of routes meant revenue, influence, and diplomatic importance. Parthian rulers could present themselves as guardians of a strategic crossing point. They could also use trade as part of broader statecraft. Relations with Rome were often tense, and commerce existed alongside rivalry, but trade still moved through the same frontier zone. The Parthians had reason to keep traffic moving, because stable trade brought customs revenue and strengthened their position over local rulers and caravan cities. They also had reason to regulate it, since controlling movement meant controlling information, tribute, and access. The Western Silk Road was never a neutral corridor. It was tied to empire, border control, and the practical question of who could safely move goods across difficult land. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of indirect exchange. Silk fragments and textile remains have been found far from their points of origin, and written sources from both Eastern and Western worlds suggest that the material passed through several hands before reaching final consumers. The surviving evidence does not always allow historians to trace a single bolt of fabric from one city to another. Instead, it points to a web of transfers, gifts, taxation, resale, and re-export. That is one reason the Silk Road is best understood as a system rather than a single path. Its strength came from many intermediaries working across long distances, not from one direct caravan line. By this stage, the Silk Road had become more than a set of inland caravan paths. Farther east and south, another power became important in the same broad network. The Kushan Empire grew out of nomadic movements in Central Asia, and by the early centuries of the Common Era had become one of the major states between China, the Iranian world, and northern India. It did not rule the whole Silk Road, something no empire ever truly did, but it made the middle of that route safer, clearer, and more connected. The Kushans took shape north of the Hindu Kush after the decline of Greco-Bactrian power. Their rise belonged to a wider Central Asian transformation, in which mobile steppe peoples settled oasis communities and older Hellenistic influences overlapped. Modern scholars usually place their strongest period between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, although the order of rulers and expansions is not always easy to reconstruct. The evidence is scattered. Coins, inscriptions, Chinese histories, and later Buddhist sources preserve different parts of the story. Taken together, they show a kingdom deeply involved in routes running through Bactria, Gandhara, Kashmir, and beyond. Geography was a major reason for that importance. The Kushans held territory along the approaches to the mountain passes that linked Central Asia with the Indian subcontinent. These routes were difficult in the best conditions. They crossed high valleys, narrow passes, and regions where local rulers could control movement by controlling water, fodder, or safe passage. A power like the Kushan state could not remove those obstacles, but it could reduce uncertainty by holding key cities and corridors. The Kushans made travel more predictable for merchants, monks, and envoys. In a world where a caravan might need weeks or months to move from one political sphere to another, even limited stability mattered. That stability was practical rather than abstract. In places such as Bactria and Gandhara, control of towns, market centers, and road junctions gave the Kushans leverage over customs, tolls, and local administration. They did not create a perfectly unified empire with the reach of a modern state. Like other pre-modern empires, they depended on negotiation with local elites, frontier commanders, and city-based communities. But this layered authority could still make routes function more smoothly. A merchant passing through Kushan territory could expect recognizable officials, accepted coinage, and some protection if travel arrangements were properly made. The Kushans also helped connect cultures that had already begun to influence one another. Their court and elite culture reflected a mixture of traditions. Kushan coins are especially revealing. They often used images and inscriptions drawn from several worlds at once: Iranian deities, Indian gods, Greek lettering, and later titles in local scripts. That mixture does not mean perfect harmony, But it does show a ruling class governing a diverse region and using forms of communication that could cross linguistic and cultural boundaries. Coinage itself was part of that process. Standardized coins made taxation pay and commercial exchange easier. They also carried royal symbols across a wide area, reminding traders and subjects that authority reached beyond a single city. The coin record also suggests how the Kushans adapted to different audiences. A coin could circulate in an urban market, pass through a military pay system, or move with a merchant caravan far from the place where it was minted. In that sense, money was one of the empire's quieter tools of integration. It did not erase local difference, but it created a shared medium across a broad zone. For an empire positioned between several larger cultural worlds, that was extremely useful. It allowed the Kushans to present themselves in forms that could be recognized by Greek-speaking, Iranian, and Indian populations alike. Buddhism moved through this same region, and the Kushans became closely associated with its spread. Here the evidence has to be handled carefully. Later Buddhist tradition gives the Kushan king Kanishka a particularly important role, and modern historians generally agree that Kushan patronage supported Buddhist institutions in Gandhara and beyond. Exactly how much of the later tradition is historical fact is harder to know. What is clear is that monasteries, reliquaries, and translated texts flourished in Kushan lands. Gandharan art, with its blend of local and Hellenistic features, shows how religious imagery could change as it traveled. The road carried not only goods but also styles of devotion, artistic methods, and organized communities of monks who depended on donors and long-distance movement. Kanishka's reign is often treated as the high point of this process, though the precise dating of his rule remains debated. Even with that uncertainty, his era marks the moment when Kushan power and Buddhist institutions seem especially closely linked in the surviving record. Chinese Buddhist histories later remembered Kanishka as a major patron, and traditions about councils and textual collection attached themselves to his name. Those accounts should not be read uncritically, but they do show how strongly the Kushan period was associated with the consolidation of Buddhist networks. Monasteries offered lodging, storage, and local knowledge. In return, travelers and donors sustained them. That relationship helped Buddhism travel beyond the mountain zones where it had first taken shape. This mattered for the Silk Road because Buddhism became one of the main traditions linking China to Central Asia and India. Chinese pilgrims and monks later traveled through Kushan territory on their way to sacred sites and centers of learning in the west and south. They depended on monasteries, root knowledge, and local support networks. The Kushan realm did not create that world from nothing, but it helped sustain the conditions in which it could grow. In that sense, the empire worked as a bridge in two directions at once. Goods moved through it, but so did texts, images, and religious teachers. The Kushans also stood at a commercial intersection. From China came silk and other high-value goods that could be carried in small quantities over long distances. From the west came glassware, metals, textiles, and other products tied to the older trade world of Iran and the Mediterranean. From India came spices, ivory, and other goods that could move north through mountain corridors or west through inland routes. The empire's central position meant that it benefited from exchange in several directions. Merchants did not need a single continuous state from end to end. They needed a chain of workable links, and Kushan territory provided several of them. Chinese sources understood this region as part of the wider Western world, though through limited information. By the Han period and afterward, reports about the Western kingdoms became more detailed. They described places that were wealthy, commercially active, and politically significant. That knowledge did not erase distance, but it made distance easier to manage. The Kushan realm, along with neighboring states, helped turn a vague western horizon into a set of known routes and named powers. For Chinese officials interested in horses, frontier security, and diplomatic reach that mattered, the Sui and Tang dynasties revived the overland Silk Road by restoring the political strength needed to support it. After long periods of division, northern China had been fragmented and harder to defend. Reunification under the Sui, followed by the more influential Tang dynasty, changed that situation. A larger, more coordinated state could maintain roads, frontier garrisons, official travel, and diplomacy on a scale earlier rulers had often struggled to sustain. It could also respond more quickly when routes were threatened, which mattered along the long western approaches where security depended on more than one city or one fortress. The Sui dynasty was short-lived, but it mattered because it ended a long period of disunity and prepared the ground for the Tang state that followed. The Sui reunified China in 589 after defeating the Qian dynasty in the south, and although it lasted only until 6118, it left behind administrative and infrastructural tools that later rulers could use. Its major projects, including transport links and stronger central control, were costly and sometimes strained the state, but they helped restore the habits of empire after centuries of separation. When the Tang took power in 618, they inherited that renewed political order and expanded it. The Tang did not create the Silk Road, but they presided over one of its most active and visible periods. With a stable capital, an organized bureaucracy, and reach across a wide empire, the dynasty could engage more consistently with the lands to the west. That did not mean the routes were controlled from end to end. It meant that trade, travel, and diplomacy could happen more regularly and under more predictable conditions. The Tang court had practical reasons to support this system. Chinese rulers still wanted horses from the west, especially the strong horses associated with Central Asian pastures. They also wanted security along the frontier and dependable contact with neighboring states. In practice, that meant close attention to Western regions, alliances, tribute missions, and the movement of merchants and envoys. Horses were not a minor luxury. They were tied to cavalry strength, border defense, and military credibility. The Tang state also used Western contacts to strengthen its standing among rival powers, because diplomatic traffic could signal influence as clearly as battlefield victories. The result was not a simple opening of borders. It was a more structured setting in which long-distance exchange could expand. This period also changed the way the court thought about the West. It was no longer treated as a distant, unknown edge. Officials and rulers were dealing with a recognizable zone of peoples, states, and roots. Some were allies, some were rivals, and some shifted position over time. The important change was that the Silk Road became part of ordinary statecraft. It was tied to diplomacy, frontier management, taxation, and the flow of wealth. That gave the road a more durable place in political life. The court could send envoys towards Central Asia, receive missions from distant rulers, and use reports from the frontier to make decisions in the capital. In this sense, the Western routes were folded into the logic of empire rather than standing outside it. Travel remained difficult, even in this stronger imperial setting. Merchants still crossed deserts, mountain passes, and oasis towns. Couriers and envoys still depended on local arrangements, seasonal timing, and cooperation from rulers along the route. But compared with periods of greater fragmentation, the journeys were more predictable. The road was still a chain of hard crossings, but it was now a chain that states could plan around and support. Where earlier centuries had often forced travelers to rely on whatever small kingdoms or local commanders happened to control a stretch of road, Tang power gave more continuity to the system, even when that continuity was uneven and had to be renewed from place to place. The Tang court also relied on people from beyond China who knew how to operate within the empire. Central Asian merchants, interpreters, entertainers, religious figures, and soldiers appear frequently in Tang cities and frontier zones. Some came for limited missions. Others settled more permanently. Their presence shows that the Silk Road was not only a route for luxury goods, it was also a system for moving skills, relationships, and information across a wide region. Men from Sogdian trading communities in particular are often visible in the surviving record because they were deeply involved in long-distance commerce and cross-cultural brokerage. They helped connect markets, translated between languages, and carried news as well as merchandise. Religious travelers also moved along these routes, including Buddhist monks and pilgrims, whose journeys left traces in texts and inscriptions. That is one reason historians treat the Tang period as a high point in the overland routes. Under a stronger empire, foreign visitors were easier to record, route systems were easier to maintain, and the movement of goods became more closely tied to state administration. The evidence from official histories, inscriptions, manuscripts, and archaeology points to sustained contact rather than isolated encounters. The Silk Road was functioning as a regular part of imperial life. Tang records preserve notices of embassies, tribute, markets, and frontier affairs. Archaeological finds from tombs and settlements also show imported objects, foreign styles, and the presence of people whose backgrounds reached beyond the Chinese heartland. Together, these sources give a picture of a connected world that was busy, practical, and politically managed. Chang'an, the Tang capital, became one of the great international cities of the pre-modern world. Its size and organization drew in people from across Eurasia. Officials, monks, traders, soldiers, and entertainers moved through it. The city was not simply foreign or simply Chinese. It was cosmopolitan in a practical sense, shaped by the broader connections of the empire. What happened there reflected the larger reach of the Silk Road. The capital's markets, guest lodgings, monasteries, and administrative offices all formed part of the same connected landscape. Goods arriving from the west could pass into court supply, elite consumption, religious patronage, or urban trade, depending on who received them and why. The city's diversity was not an abstract ideal. It was the result of regular movement through imperial channels. That urban life matters because it shows how the system worked at its fullest. The Silk Road was not only a line between distant capitals, it was a network of exchanges that could end in a market, a religious community, a workshop, or a household. Under the Sui and Tang, the overland routes entered one of their most confident phases because the political center of China was strong enough to support them without rebuilding them from nothing. It inherited older paths, organized them more effectively, and gave them a larger role in imperial affairs. The revival was therefore not just about travel. Chang'an, the Tang capital, was where the Silk Road became visible in everyday urban life. It was not only a political center. Envoys arrived from foreign courts, merchants from Central Asia moved goods and information, and customs from distant regions left traces in food, dress, music, and religion. The city's cosmopolitan character was tied to its role as the administrative heart of a large empire. Power drew people inward, and trade followed that power back into the capital. The Tang court kept formal relations with many frontier and foreign groups, and those relations often passed through Chang'an. Embassies brought tribute, gifts, and requests for favor. The court answered with recognition, titles, and access to trade. These exchanges were not merely symbolic. They helped organize movement across Central Asia and made the capital a place where diplomacy and commerce met in the same streets and markets. Officials regulated where foreigners could live, who could trade, and when movement was allowed more freely, that control did not make the city closed. It made foreign presence visible and manageable. In a city as large as Chang'an, order depended on classification, and classification often began with origin, occupation, or legal status. Accounts from the period, together with archaeology and art, suggest how varied that urban world could be. Some merchants came from Sogdiana, a region whose traders were especially important in moving goods and language across Central Asia. Others came from farther west or south, bringing different clothing, foods, and customs. Musicians and entertainers also traveled widely, and Tang elite culture clearly noticed them. Painted tombs and written sources show interest in foreign instruments, foreign dress, and foreign styles of performance. Tomb art should not be treated as an exact record of daily life, but it does show that outsiders were important enough to enter elite imagination. Foreignness could be admired as well as regulated, which is one reason Chang'an remained so important in later memory. Food offers another way to see the change. The Tang period saw greater contact with ingredients and cooking styles moving through Central Asia. Some foods were imported directly. Others spread through adaptation, as people in the capital learned to use new products in local settings. The point is not that Chang'an abandoned Chinese traditions. It is that the city absorbed additions from beyond the frontier and made them part of its own rhythm. Fashion changed in a similar way. Certain robes, hairstyles, and accessories associated with Central Asian or Western styles became popular at court and in the city. These details reflected the prestige of the routes, the people who traveled them, and the social life of the capital, where officials, courtiers, merchants, and entertainers watched one another and borrowed what seemed elegant or novel. The city also contained religious communities shaped by long-distance movement. Buddhism was already important, but Chang'an was not limited to Buddhism alone. Muslims, Taoists, Buddhists, Manichaeans, and Nestorian Christians appear in Tang-era sources in different ways, though the evidence is uneven and should not be flattened into a simple story of harmony. Some groups were small. Some were closely watched. Some remained marginal. Still, the capital offered a setting in which foreign belief could be known, discussed, translated, and sometimes practiced. A large imperial city could hold more difference than a small court town. It also reminds us that the Silk Road carried texts and ideas as well as cloth or metalwork. Religious identity often traveled with merchants, diplomats, and migrants, and once it reached the capital, it could be copied, debated, or adapted. At street level, this cosmopolitan life depended on practical systems. Markets had to be supplied, lodging had to be arranged, warehouses, granaries, and offices had to support the movement of people and goods. The Silk Road did not end at a ceremonial gate. It entered the city through transport, inspection, exchange, and consumption. A bale of cloth, a package of spices, a horse, a book, or a religious image could move from a frontier corridor into a workshop, a temple, or an aristocratic household. By the Tang period, the Silk Road was not just a channel for luxury goods, though luxury mattered. It was a system that shaped how an imperial capital looked and functioned. It affected labor, taxation, storage, and administration. Even the city's scale depended on these systems, because a metropolis could remain open to outside movement only if officials could track and support the flows that came with it. Chang'an therefore shows the Silk Road at its fullest. Earlier routes, frontier posts, oases, and the merchants who kept them moving came together here. In the capital, the road was no longer only something distant, crossing deserts and passes. It had become part of daily urban life, where foreign envoys, court politics, markets, and local routines met in one place. That is why Chang'an matters in the history of the Silk Road. If Chang'an showed the Silk Road at its most visible, the steppe showed the conditions that made it possible. Across the grasslands of inner Eurasia, movement followed a different rhythm from the settled farming states of China, Iran, or the Mediterranean. Pastoral communities lived with herds, seasonal pasture, and long-distance mobility. They were not outside the Silk Road. In many periods, they helped carry it. The steppe was not a single empty expanse. It was a vast zone of grassland, river valleys, and migratory corridors stretching across Central Asia. Horses, sheep, and camels could be raised there in ways that supported travel and transport over long distances. For the empires to the south, that mattered in practical terms. Steppe peoples supplied horses, guides, guards, and intermediaries. They also controlled stretches of terrain that caravans had to cross or skirt. A route between settled regions was never just a line of trade. It was a passage through political territory, and in the steppe, that territory often belonged to mobile confederations rather than fixed borders. Chinese sources, Persian chronicles, and later historical reconstruction show that the peoples of the steppe were not a single nation or kingdom. They changed over time. Xiongnu, Turks, Uyghurs, and others rose to prominence in different periods, often building confederations rather than centralized states in the settled imperial sense. Some groups raided frontier districts, others negotiated treaties, demanded tribute, or entered alliances with dynasties that wanted stable access to horses and trade. The pattern shifted from century to century, but the basic fact remained the same. No major overland network across Eurasia could ignore the power of the grasslands. That power was military, but it was also diplomatic. Steppe rulers and envoys moved between courts, carrying messages, marriage offers, warnings, and requests for trade. In some periods, diplomacy was backed by force. In others, it rested on the promise of security along major routes. The Chinese court often treated relations with frontier peoples as a mixture of defense, gift exchange, and negotiation. At the western end of the routes, rulers in Sogdiana, the Iranian plateau, and the Oasis kingdoms also had to deal with steppe power. Caravans needed safe passage, and safe passage usually depended on the approval of those who controlled the land between one settled zone and the next. Steppe society was sometimes described by settled writers as if it stood apart from civilization, but that is more a reflection of outsider prejudice than historical reality. Steppe groups had their own political structures, elite traditions, and economic networks. They were deeply involved in exchange from the beginning. A horse from the steppe might travel south. Silk, grain, metalwork, or textiles might move north or west in return. The relationship was not one-sided. The Silk Road did not simply bring goods outward from China to passive recipients. It connected regions that each had something to offer, and the steppe was one of the places where those exchanges were tested, negotiated, and redirected. This exchange was especially important because the horse was not just a commodity. In the ancient and early medieval world, horses altered the speed of war, communication, and transport. Chinese dynasties repeatedly sought strong horses from the grasslands to strengthen cavalry and frontier defense. In return, steppe elites often valued silk, not only as clothing or luxury cloth, but as a mark of rank that could be redistributed to allies and followers. Archaeology has also helped fill in the picture. Burial goods, textile fragments, metalwork, and caravan finds show a pattern of movement that does not fit a simple east-to-west story. Objects, techniques, and styles traveled in many directions, and steppe zones helped connect them. There is also an important difference between control and movement. Even when no empire unified the whole route, steppe peoples could make travel easier or harder simply by keeping order over wide spaces. Their mobility gave them an advantage in patrol, communication, and rapid response. Later historians sometimes call this corridor power because it allowed them to shape the flow of traffic without building walled cities or permanent garrisons in the same way as sedentary states. That did not mean the steppe was stable in a modern sense. It meant that stability there depended on relationships, tribute, seasonal movement, and the authority of leaders who could command loyalty across distance. This was one reason the Silk Road remained flexible. Routes shifted when political conditions changed. Caravans avoided dangerous areas and favored lines where local power was predictable. In some periods, steppe confederations protected those lines. In other periods, they disrupted them. Either way, they influenced where merchants went and how they prepared. A road that crossed the grasslands was never only an economic matter. It was tied to diplomacy, warfare, and the practical needs of pastoral life, where movement itself was a way of survival. The earliest large-scale interactions between Chinese states and the northern grasslands already showed this pattern. As early imperial China expanded, frontier security became a permanent concern, and steppe confederations emerged in response to the same pressures and opportunities. Control of pasture, tribute from agricultural borderlands, and access to trade all became part of the contest. Later, when stronger imperial powers and stronger nomadic confederations both existed at the same time, the relationship could become more structured. Trade agreements, marriage alliances, hostage exchanges, and military campaigns all served the larger goal of managing the space between settled regions rather than simply conquering it. Travel did not carry goods alone. It also carried texts, doctrines, and the people who could read them. As routes across Central Asia became more regular, they linked monasteries, courts, and learning communities as well as markets. Religion in this region rarely stayed fixed in one place for long. It moved with merchants, with rulers who offered support, and with pilgrims and scholars who believed a distant sacred site or teaching center was worth the journey. Buddhism is the clearest early example. It had begun spreading from northern India into Central Asia before the Silk Road became a familiar historical label, and by the early centuries of the Common Era, it was established in many oasis towns. Monks traveled with caravans or along the same corridors caravans used. Some were pilgrims seeking relics or sacred sites. Others were teachers, translators, or copyists. Their journeys are known partly from their own writings and partly from later accounts, though later traditions sometimes mix fact with pious memory. Even so, the record shows that movement along the road helped Buddhist ideas take root far from their place of origin. In some places, Buddhism was welcomed by local elites who saw monasteries as useful institutions capable of attracting travelers, storing wealth, and lending prestige to a town. In others, it spread more gradually through repeated contact, as a small community of monks came to serve a settlement already tied to caravan traffic. Among the best-known travelers are Qian in the early 5th century and Zhang in the 7th. Both made long journeys into India and returned with texts and first-hand observations. Their accounts are valuable because they do more than repeat hearsay. They describe monasteries, languages, local customs, and the condition of roads and states along the way. In that sense, they were not only pilgrims, they were also witnesses to how the route worked in practice. Zhang, especially, helped bring back a large body of Sanskrit material that Chinese scholars translated with increasing care. His journey came during the Tang period, when the court and urban monasteries were more open to foreign knowledge, and when translation had become an organized intellectual task rather than an occasional act of devotion. Both men show how pilgrimage could become scholarship. A holy journey might begin with devotion, but it could end with a manuscript collection, a travel record, and a wider map of the known world. Translation was one of the most important forms of Silk Road exchange, even though it rarely appears in simple lists of goods. A text could travel farther than a temple or a city, but it did not travel unchanged. Words for doctrine, ritual, law, and philosophy had to be matched across languages that did not share the same terms or concepts. That work took place in monasteries and court-sponsored translation bureaus, where monks, scribes, and interpreters compared manuscripts and debated meanings. Chinese, Sanskrit, Khotanese, Sogdian, Tocharian, and other languages appear in the manuscript record from the root zones, showing how multilingual the network really was. A single work might move from one language to another more than once before it reached a new audience. Translation was therefore not just copying, it was interpretation, and sometimes adjustment, because a term that made sense in one religious setting might need explanation in another. Manuscripts are some of the most concrete evidence for this process. Fragments found in oasis sites and cave libraries show prayers, sutras, administrative notes, letters, and commercial documents written on paper, silk, wood, and other materials. They are often damaged, but their survival is useful precisely because it shows ordinary use. These were not only prestige copies, many were working texts carried, repaired, recopied, and stored in local religious centers. The famous Dunhuang cache, sealed for centuries in a cave and rediscovered in modern times, is especially important, though it belongs to a later phase of the road's history than its earliest beginnings. It shows how a borderland archive could preserve the daily record of religious life, instruction, and translation across the network. It also shows how closely religious and practical writing could sit together. In the same broad archive, scholars find devotional texts, teaching materials, state paperwork, and private letters, which suggests that monasteries were not isolated from society, but deeply embedded in it. Other faiths also traveled this way. Manichaeism spread eastward through Central Asian communities. Nestorian Christianity, as the tradition later came to be called in the West, also reached inner Asian and Chinese settings. though the surviving evidence is uneven and often comes from inscriptions, later church memory, or isolated textual finds. These religions did not simply arrive unchanged and remain foreign. They adapted to local patrons, local vocabulary, and local artistic styles. Sometimes they borrowed the visual language of Buddhism, sometimes they used the administrative habits of the states that protected them. The result was layered exchange rather than uniform belief. A prayer, a sermon, or a manuscript could cross several cultural frontiers before it reached its next audience. A single oasis town might host more than one religious community, and the people living there would have encountered multiple traditions not as abstract systems, but as part of daily civic life. Pilgrims mattered because they tied faith to geography. Sacred places became more important when someone had walked to them. Monks moving between India, Central Asia, and China returned with descriptions of monasteries, relics, and practices that could be compared with local tradition. Those journeys also helped standardize routes. A well-traveled pilgrim might note where water could be found, which oasis ruler was hospitable, or which monastery offered shelter. Religious travel and commercial travel reinforced each other. The same inns, gates, passes, and caravan schedules served both. A merchant might carry silk, a monk might carry a manuscript. Often they moved in the same company. In practical terms, religious exchange depended on the ordinary infrastructure of movement. Roads had to remain passable, hosts had to be available, local authorities had to tolerate strangers. When those conditions existed, ideas could move almost as reliably as commodities. Writing systems changed in the process as well. Scripts were borrowed, adapted, and simplified as communities needed them for trade, administration, and worship. The Silk Road did not create writing, but it encouraged written cultures to overlap. Bilingual inscriptions translated sutras, and commercial records show how people managed communication across distance. In some places, scribes became a bridge between worlds. They preserved local languages while also learning the languages of rulers, merchants, and neighboring faiths. The road, therefore, carried more than ideas in the abstract. It carried the practical tools that made ideas durable. Travel on the Silk Road was never as simple as drawing a line between two cities. Even in its busiest periods, movement depended on weather, water, animals, local contacts, and patience. A caravan could not cross the desert by force alone. It needed knowledge of wells, resting places, and the distance a loaded animal could manage before it weakened. That practical knowledge shaped the road as much as any empire did. Camels became especially important because they could carry heavy loads and endure long stretches with limited water. In the dry regions of Central Asia and the Tarim Basin, that made them more useful than many other animals. Horses, donkeys, and mules also carried goods, especially where terrain changed or shorter routes linked one oasis to another. But the camel became the symbol of long-distance overland trade for a reason. It suited the work. It could move through sand, cross rough ground, and travel in groups that were easier to guide than a single large wagon. The road was built around the limits of animal strength. A caravan that pushed too hard could lose both time and cargo. Food and water were constant concerns. Travelers had to plan for long stretches where supplies were scarce and for days when the next settlement might be farther away than expected. Dried grain, bread, dates, tea in later centuries, and other portable foods were useful because they lasted. Water had to be measured carefully, and departures often followed the availability of wells or seasonal conditions. Geography dictated routine. A route was not chosen simply because it was shortest. It was chosen because it could be survived. Clothing and equipment mattered too. Travelers needed garments that handled heat in the day and cold at night. They used coverings against dust and wind. Pack ropes, saddles, bags, and containers had to hold together under repeated movement. A broken strap or damaged bundle could create serious trouble in a place where replacement was not easy. Merchants, monks, and officials all depended on the same ordinary tools. Luxury goods may have been the best-known cargo, but the road itself was sustained by leather, cloth, cord, and repair. Even the way goods were packed affected what could move. Silk traveled well because it was light for its value, but so did spices, lacquerware, medicines, paper, metals, and other items that justified the cost of transport. Bulkier goods could move too, but only when the route, season, and profit made sense. Security was another part of the system. Caravans usually moved in groups because isolation was dangerous. Banditry existed, though its scale and frequency varied by place and period. Local rulers often charged fees or offered protection in exchange for revenue, and merchants learned which agreements were worth trusting. Guides and escorts could help a caravan navigate difficult stretches. In some periods, empires stationed soldiers or officials near major routes, but even then, the movement of goods still relied on cooperation among travelers, local communities, and frontier authorities. The road was not secure in any absolute sense. It was managed, negotiated, and used with caution. That meant travel was political at a small scale. A merchant needed permission or at least tolerance from people who controlled passes, wells, gates, and market points. The route changed when those local arrangements changed. That caution shaped the pace of travel. Caravan movement was slow, and its slowness was part of its logic. People traveled when conditions allowed, not when convenience demanded it. They stopped in oases, fortifications, market towns, and monasteries when those places offered water, shelter, information, or trade. A caravan did not simply pass through empty space. It advanced from one human stop to the next. Each halt gave merchants a chance to rest animals, exchange news, and meet intermediaries who knew the local terrain. Over time, those repeated stops gave the Silk Road a rhythm. It was not a single continuous road in the modern sense. It was a sequence of journeys stitched together by routine. This is one reason historians often speak of the Silk Road in the plural. Different branches mattered in different centuries, and the practical shape of the network shifted as markets, states, and climates shifted with it. That routine also made specialization possible. Some people did not produce the goods they carried, they moved them. Others supplied fodder, repaired tack, counted cargo, translated languages, or arranged storage. Inns and caravanserais became important in many regions because they reduced risk and made long-distance movement more practical. Their presence did not eliminate hardship, but it gave trade a structure. A merchant who knew where the next safe stop lay could plan further ahead. A pilgrim could travel with a better sense of what lay between one region and the next. Even soldiers and diplomats depended on the same network of staging points. Where such facilities were reliable, commerce tended to deepen because traders could make the journey in manageable stages instead of gambling everything on one exhausting run. In that sense, the Silk Road was also a labor system. It tied together animal handlers, porters, guides, guards, scribes, hosts, and traders. It required knowledge that was often local and inherited rather than written down. People learned the road through use, memory, and observation. Which pass was safest in a given season, which oasis was reliable, which official could be approached, which language would be understood in a market town. These were practical questions, and the answers mattered. The road survived because enough people knew how to make it work. Written records from different periods, including travel accounts, administrative documents, and merchant correspondence, show that this knowledge was constantly being applied and adapted rather than simply preserved as tradition. The road was maintained by repetition, but never by repetition alone. If the overland routes were the backbone of Silk Road exchange, the Indian Ocean was its wide southern extension. The two systems were never fully separate. Goods that moved across Central Asia often reached the west through ports, while items from the Mediterranean, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia could enter the wider Eurasian economy by sea and then move inland through caravan towns. Merchants used whichever path offered the best balance of cost, speed, security, and season. The Indian Ocean mattered because it reduced dependence on a single chain of deserts and mountain passes. A camel caravan could carry valuable cargo across dry terrain, but it moved slowly and depended on wells, pasture, and political protection. Sea transport could move larger loads at once, especially bulk goods, though it had its own limits. Ships had to follow winds, coastal knowledge, and port schedules. They were tied to the monsoon system, which made the ocean a seasonal highway rather than an open road in the modern sense. That monsoon pattern was one of the most important technical facts in the history of Eurasian trade. Sailors learned that the seasonal winds could carry them in one direction for part of the year and bring them back later. This did not make travel easy, but it made it predictable enough to support regular commerce. Ports around the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, Western India, and the eastern coast of Africa became fixed points in a wider trading world. Ships could leave one coast, wait for the right wind, and return months later with cargoes gathered from several regions. In some places, this rhythm encouraged merchants to keep warehouses, agents, and family partners at distant ports, so business could continue even when the sea was closed by the seasons. This is why overland and maritime exchange often reinforced each other. A trader in Central Asia might never see the Indian Ocean, yet the value of silk, spices, textiles, or precious stones could depend on a chain that included both caravan and ship. Likewise, a merchant in an Indian port might sell goods that had first arrived overland from the interior. The Silk Road was not replaced by sea trade in one step. For a long time, the two systems overlapped. Each carried some of the same luxuries, but each also specialized in different kinds of movement. Land routes were often better for direct contact with inland courts and city markets, while sea routes could gather produce from many coastal regions and move it in larger volumes. The result was not a single route, but a connected web. The ports themselves became important meeting places. India had a long tradition of coastal commerce, with goods moving from interior markets down river systems and over short land routes to the shore. Greek and Roman writers knew of this trade, though their descriptions are incomplete and shaped by their own interests. Archaeological finds, coin hoards, and references in later texts suggest a busy world of exchange, but the exact volume of trade is sometimes hard to measure. Still, the broad picture is clear. The Indian Ocean linked many local economies into a larger commercial field, and that field touched the Silk Road at several points. Harbors could become multilingual spaces where contracts were arranged, cargoes were repacked, and imported goods were redistributed to smaller markets inland. In that way, a port was not just an endpoint. It was a hinge between systems. Arabian and Persian merchants played a major role in this system. So did Indian traders, and, in later centuries, Chinese maritime activity expanded as well. The sources do not show one single dominant people or one fixed route. Instead, they show a layered network of specialists: ship owners, pilots, dock workers, warehouse managers, brokers, and translators. The same was true on land, where middlemen bridged languages and customs. At sea, as on the Caravan trail, commerce depended on trust built over time. Credit had to be honored, cargo had to be identified, partnerships had to survive across distance. Written agreements mattered where they existed, but reputation mattered too, because trade often depended on people who knew one another only by report, recommendation, or repeated dealings over several seasons. Certain goods fit the maritime world especially well: spices, aromatics, textiles, precious stones, metals, porcelain in later periods, and other compact valuables could justify the cost of long transport. Bulk staples also moved within regional circuits, though much of the long-range trade focused on high-value items. That mattered because the Indian Ocean economy was not just about moving luxury objects for their own sake. It was about creating a system in which distant markets could be reached when local production was not enough, or when a buyer wanted something associated with prestige, ritual, or refinement. Pepper from India, aromatics from southern Arabia, fine cloth from Indian weaving centers, and later ceramics from China all fit this pattern in different periods. Their value came not only from rarity, but from the fact that they could be carried far without losing much worth. The sea lanes also carried ideas, though usually more gradually than political power. Languages spread along trade corridors. Religious communities established themselves in port. Travel made contact between regions more frequent, and that contact left traces in names, loanwords, artistic styles, and technologies. As with the overland routes, the evidence comes from a mix of written records and material remains. No single document explains the whole system. The history has to be assembled from many smaller signs. A harbor inscription, a wrecked cargo, a borrowed term in a merchant language, or the presence of foreign-style beads in a burial can all point to the same larger pattern of movement. The Mongol conquest changed Eurasian travel in a practical way. Before it, merchants and envoys moved through a patchwork of rival states, local rulers, frontier taxes, and uncertain protection. Under Mongol rule, large stretches of that world were brought under one imperial system, or at least under closely related khanates that recognized a shared political order for a time. That did not erase danger, and it did not make travel easy, but it did make movement more predictable than it had been across many earlier centuries. The Silk Road depended less on a single road than on a chain of permissions. A caravan needed safe passage through one region after another. It needed recognized stops, reliable intermediaries, and officials willing to honor travel arrangements. The Mongol Empire helped create those conditions on a wider scale. In some regions, roads were repaired, stations were maintained, and merchants could move with greater confidence. Envoys from one court to another also found that distance, while still great, no longer meant complete isolation. The routes did not become uniform, but they did become more usable across a broad sweep of Asia. The Mongols did not invent long-distance exchange. They inherited older caravan routes, oasis towns, and merchant communities that had been functioning for centuries. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar had long served as points of exchange before the Mongol conquests. And those older commercial habits did not disappear when the new rulers arrived. But by linking those routes through conquest, alliance, and administration, they made the whole system work more continuously. Some historians describe this as a kind of Eurasian integration, though that term can sound more orderly than the reality was. The empire was large, uneven, and often unstable at the margins. Still, for a significant period, it reduced the number of separate barriers between East Asia, Central Asia, the Islamic world, and parts of Europe. That administrative order also depended on information. Mongol rulers valued messengers, maps, tribute records, and reports from distant places. They relied on relay systems and service obligations to keep communication moving. In different parts of the empire, local practices remained important, but the larger framework made it possible for officials, diplomats, and merchants to imagine a connected space that stretched far beyond a single kingdom. In that sense, the Mongol period did not simply open roads. It made connection a more visible part of imperial rule. The state's ability to collect information and move it quickly became one of the things that held the system together. Merchants benefited from this as well. They did not travel alone in the romantic sense sometimes attached to the Silk Road in later retellings. They traveled in organized groups with guides, translators, letters of introduction, and commercial partnerships. A trader moving across Mongol-controlled territory might rely on a chain of people who spoke different languages and knew different customs. That layered system of trust was essential. It allowed goods to move farther, and it allowed merchants to deal with strangers who might otherwise have been impossible to approach. It also meant that trade became less dependent on chance encounters and more dependent on procedures, written credentials, and recognized authority. The movement of envoys was equally important. The Mongol courts exchanged missions with neighboring powers, and some of those journeys were recorded in enough detail to show how extensive the routes had become. These accounts include travelers from Europe and the Middle East as well as from Asia, though the surviving descriptions reflect the interests of the writers and the political purposes of the missions. They are useful not because they give a single complete picture, but because they confirm that the routes were being used in multiple directions by people carrying diplomacy, intelligence, and bargaining power, along with commercial goods. In some cases, these missions were tied to demands for tribute or requests for alliance. In others, they were part of attempts to learn about distant rulers and rival states. This greater movement also carried knowledge. Technologies, artistic styles, medical ideas, and geographic information circulated more quickly when large parts of the route were under connected rule. Some transfers are well documented in written sources. Others are clearer in the archaeological record, where objects and designs appear in places that show contact across long distances. Not every similarity proves direct borrowing, and not every story of transmission is equally secure. But the overall pattern is clear enough. The Mongol age made Eurasia more legible to itself. Travelers could compare maps, place names, and administrative practices across territories that had once felt much farther apart. The result was not a single unified culture, but a wider field of contact in which information could travel with unusual reach. At the same time, the same connections that helped trade also helped disease move. That danger would become impossible to ignore in the next century when plague traveled through the same linked world. During the Mongol period, the Silk Road became less a loose chain of exchanges and more a connected imperial system. That did not mean every route was safe or every journey simple. It meant that merchants, envoys, artisans, and scholars could cross far more territory under political arrangements that, for a time, reduced some of the friction that had long made overland travel difficult. In practical terms, that changed what could move, who could move, and how often. One reason this mattered was that Mongol rulers valued information as much as tribute. They relied on movement across distance. Diplomats carried messages between courts, administrators gathered reports from frontier regions, skilled workers were transferred from one part of the empire to another. In some cases, rulers deliberately relocated craftsmen, physicians, and engineers, so useful knowledge would not remain confined to a single city or region. The result was a wider circulation of techniques and practices than the older caravan world had usually allowed. This depended on a political order that stretched across much of Eurasia in the 13th and 14th centuries. After the conquests of Genghis Khan and his successors, the empire was not one simple, peaceful whole, and it was never equally stable everywhere. But in the decades when Mongol rule was strongest, large stretches of the route system fell under related administrations, or at least under rulers who recognized one another's power. That reduced some tolls, border obstacles, and local uncertainties. Merchants could sometimes use relay stations and official passes. Envoys moved through a world where the state itself expected mobility and, to a degree, organized it. The postal relay system, often described in later sources as the Yam, is part of this story because it made fast communication over long distances more practical than it had been in many earlier periods. There is good evidence for this in travelers' accounts and in material remains found along the routes. Written sources describe unusually broad travel under Mongol protection, though those accounts differ in detail and should be read carefully. Archaeological finds also show connections in ceramics, metalwork, textiles, and artistic motifs across large distances. A design pattern might appear in Central Asia and later in China, or a method of decorating a vessel might turn up in a place where it had not been common before. Not every parallel proves direct transmission, and historians are cautious about claiming a single line of influence where several possibilities exist. Even so, the combined evidence shows a period in which Eurasia was linked with unusual clarity. Maps and geographic knowledge moved more actively in this world as well. Couriers and envoys carried practical information about roads, river crossings, stations, and political boundaries. Merchants brought their own knowledge of season, terrain, and local custom. Some of this information was written down, while some remained in oral network. Over time, rulers and advisors could build a more detailed picture of lands far from their own capitals. The Mongol Age did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced the isolation that had often made distant regions seem indistinct or legendary, that mattered for governing, because empires that expanded so quickly needed reliable information about taxation, supplies, and military movement. It also mattered for trade, because better knowledge of where to stop, whom to trust, and what hazards lay ahead could make long-distance exchange more regular. Medical knowledge traveled alongside trade and administration. Physicians in one region could encounter remedies, ingredients, and diagnostic traditions from another. Texts were translated and adapted, and practical treatments moved with the people who knew how to use them. Here, too, the evidence is mixed. Some practices are visible in surviving manuscripts. Others are inferred from later references or from the appearance of certain ingredients and techniques in new settings. The broad trend is still clear. The roots did not carry goods alone. They carried attempts to solve human problems, including illness, by borrowing from more than one tradition. In a connected imperial setting, a court physician, a translator, or a scholar might encounter Persian, Chinese, Central Asian, or Islamic medical ideas and compare them directly, rather than through a chain of distant summaries. Artistic styles moved in similar ways. Decorative forms, themes from court culture, and techniques of depiction crossed from one workshop to another. A painter, potter, or metalworker might adapt a foreign pattern to local taste. That process did not produce uniformity, it produced mixture. A motif could be repeated, simplified, or combined with older local forms. This is one reason the Mongol period stands out in the history of the Silk Road. It was not only a time of movement, it was a time when movement left visible traces in objects that survive. In ceramics, for example, one can sometimes see shapes from one region combined with glazes or painted designs associated with another. In manuscripts and luxury goods too, the exchange of styles shows that the flow of ideas was not separate from the flow of trade. It was part of the same larger system. Yet the same integration that made exchange easier also made the system more vulnerable. The more closely the routes were connected, the easier it became for danger to move along them. Plague was one of the most important of those dangers. The exact path of any outbreak is sometimes hard to reconstruct, and historians remain careful about the limits of the evidence. But there is no serious doubt that the connected world of the Mongol Age helped disease spread over long distances. Caravans, ports, stations, and cities all provided points where people met, and those meetings could transmit more than language or merchandise. Urban density, troop movement, and regular traffic between regions all made the problem more serious once disease entered the network. That created a difficult balance. The Mongol order made travel more predictable in many places, and that predictability helped commerce, administration, and cultural contact. But connectedness also meant that disruption in one region could echo elsewhere. A route that carried silk, paper, and stoneware could also carry infection. A network strong enough to tie Eurasia together was also a network through which crisis could move. The administrative tools that made exchange easier could not fully control the biological consequences of movement. Even where roads remained open, confidence in them could weaken if merchants, townspeople, or officials believed that danger was traveling too efficiently. The Black Death did not strike the Silk Road as a single event in one place. It moved through the same connected system that had long supported trade, diplomacy, and travel during the Mongol period, which made it difficult to contain. The disease likely emerged in Inner Asia, though historians still debate the exact origin. From there, it spread along commercial and administrative routes, carried by people, animals, cargo, and river and sea traffic. That pattern shows how the Silk Road worked at its most vulnerable. It was not just a line between distant regions, it was a web of repeated contact, and repeated contact allowed infection to move onward. By the 1340s, plague was appearing in places tied directly or indirectly to the wider Eurasian network. One often repeated account concerns the Crimean port of Kaffa, where later European writers described a siege during which bodies were thrown into the city. That story is familiar, but it rests on later reports and should be treated cautiously. What is more secure is that the Black Sea trade world was deeply connected to routes running east and south, and disease moved within that commercial environment. From the Black Sea, plague reached Mediterranean ports. From there, it spread into Italy and then across much of Europe. At the same time, it moved through parts of the Islamic world and farther into Asia. It did not travel by one road only. It moved through many linked roads and harbors, which is why Silk Road history in this period cannot be separated from maritime history. The wider setting mattered as well. In the decades before the Great Outbreak, the Mongol Empire and its successor states had created conditions for unusually rapid movement across Eurasia. Officials maintained relay systems, merchants received protection in some zones, and caravans could pass through a long chain of markets and way stations. That system was useful for goods, letters, and envoys. It also meant that once plague entered the network, it could move with the same speed. Historians do not all agree on a single line of transmission, but many see the spread as a combination of overland and maritime contact, rather than one dramatic crossing. The human consequences were severe. In many regions, population losses were enormous, though the scale varied and exact figures are uncertain. Farming communities lost labor, towns lost taxpayers, craftsmen, and customers. Some regions saw wages rise because workers were scarcer. Others saw land go unused or production shift. Governments tried to respond with measures that often came too late or were only partly effective. Across Eurasia, the epidemic changed expectations about mobility and risk. Travel remained necessary, but it no longer seemed neutral. A merchant, pilgrim, or envoy could carry danger as well as news and merchandise, even if no one understood transmission in modern terms. The plague also weakened confidence in the institutions that had supported the Mongol network. Under stable rule, merchants had benefited from protected roads, passports, relay stations, and city markets. Once disease spread widely, that same infrastructure looked different. Cities that had been centers of exchange became places of fear as well as opportunity. Quarantines and local restrictions appeared in some regions, especially in Mediterranean port cities, where authorities began experimenting with controls on incoming traffic. These measures did not stop the disease at once, but they show a shift in attitude. Connectedness was still valuable, yet it was no longer seen as harmless. It is also important not to imagine a simple collapse. Trade did not end, and the Silk Road did not vanish overnight. Merchants still moved. Goods still changed hands. Pilgrims still traveled. What changed was the background condition of the network. Large-scale exchange now took place with a sharper awareness that routes could carry crisis as well as wealth. In some places, political fragmentation after the decline of Mongol unity made this worse. Local rulers, rival states, and shifting borders could interrupt movement or raise costs. In others, trade adapted through new arrangements, but the easy confidence of the earlier Mongol age was gone. The disease also altered the balance between cities and countryside. In parts of Eurasia, abandoned fields and reduced labor supplies changed what could be grown, taxed, and transported. Some urban centers recovered unevenly, while others lost their former prominence for a time. Ports and caravan cities that had relied on steady traffic now had to reckon with interruption, fear, and changing commercial patterns. In that sense, the plague was not only a medical crisis, it was an economic and administrative crisis as well, and its effects reached far beyond the first wave of mortality. As the 14th and 15th centuries unfolded, the overland routes of Eurasia did not disappear, but they became harder to sustain. The Silk Road had always relied on a chain of political arrangements. When that chain held, caravans could move through several regions with some confidence that duties, protection, and passage would remain predictable enough to justify the journey. When it broke, the road still existed on the map, but it no longer functioned as a single system. The first major problem was fragmentation. After Mongol unity declined, the broad imperial space that had stretched across much of inner Eurasia divided into separate khanates, regional powers, and rival courts. These successor states did not all shut the routes, and some still supported trade because they benefited from it. But they no longer managed the road as one coordinated corridor. A merchant moving from one realm to another could face different taxes, changing rules, or new demands for gifts and permits. The result was higher cost and greater uncertainty. Overland commerce remained possible, but it was less regular and often less efficient than it had been under more unified rule. Conflict also altered the frontier zones. Earlier Silk Road routes had already passed through contested regions, but later divisions could make those crossings more dangerous or more expensive to secure. Caravan trade depended on more than a line across a map. It needed wells, garrisons, interpreters, markets, fodder, and local officials willing to let traffic continue. When warfare, succession disputes, or shifting alliances disrupted those conditions, movement slowed. Some routes were abandoned for a time, while others were rerouted through safer branches. The network remained flexible, but that flexibility carried a cost. At the same time, the balance of demand across Eurasia was changing. The classic overland route had long been supported by luxury goods and the prestige attached to distant products. Silk remained valuable, but trade patterns were never fixed. Regional courts and urban markets developed new tastes, while some goods became easier to obtain through other channels. As sea travel expanded, especially around the Indian Ocean, merchants and states increasingly turned to maritime routes that could carry larger cargoes with fewer overland handoffs. The land road did not become useless, but it faced stronger competition for many kinds of bulk trade. Ships offered advantages caravans could not match. This shift did not happen everywhere at once. In Central Asia, oasis towns and desert crossings still mattered. In Iran, Anatolia, the steppe, and parts of South Asia, overland exchange remained important for regional economies and diplomatic traffic. But the older pattern of long caravan chains linking multiple imperial worlds began to lose centrality. What had once been a main artery for certain forms of exchange became one route among several, and not always the most efficient one. Some cities adjusted by relying more on local trade, taxation, or the movement of pilgrims and envoys. Others declined as through traffic thinned. The roadmap remained familiar, but the commercial rhythm changed. There is also a matter of scale. The Silk Road was never maintained by one permanent institution that could preserve it in all conditions. It survived when empires, city-states, merchant communities, and local rulers all found reasons to support it. When those interests aligned, the road could flourish. When they did not, it became thinner, more fragmented, and more regional in practice. Trade continued, but through narrower channels, shorter stretches, and more negotiated crossings. That is why historians often describe this period not as the end of the Silk Road, but as a weakening of the classic overland system. The surviving evidence fits that picture. Travel accounts, diplomatic records, and merchant paperwork show continued movement, but they also suggest more friction. Routes are described with greater attention to risk, delay, and patronage. Some caravan traffic still linked China, Central Asia, Iran, and the Black Sea world, but it did so in an environment where local conditions mattered more than any older imperial guarantee. Continuity remained real, yet it depended on a patchwork of permissions rather than a broad shared order. By the late medieval period, long-distance exchange was being supplemented, and in some cases overtaken, by other forms of connection. The rise of sea power changed long-distance trade by moving more of it onto ships and into port cities. The Silk Road did not disappear, and caravans still crossed Central Asia, the Tarim Basin, Iran, and the Levant. But as overland routes became less unified, maritime trade gained advantages that were hard to ignore. Ships could carry larger loads, move around many of the political boundaries that complicated land travel, and connect harbor cities directly to major commercial routes. Over time, that made the sea a more practical choice for merchants, states, and consumers. The Indian Ocean was central to this change. It had long supported trade alongside the overland routes, but it became more important as navigational knowledge improved and port cities expanded. Sailors learned to use the monsoon winds, which made seasonal travel possible across the Arabian Sea and between East Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Chinese coast. These voyages still depended on timing, weather, and local knowledge, but they could move far more goods than caravans. Pepper, aromatics, textiles, ceramics, metals, and later larger volumes of bulk cargo all moved through this maritime world. The sea did not replace the land at once, but it steadily changed the scale of exchange. By the medieval period, especially from the early second millennium onward, merchants across these waters were working within more regular seasonal patterns, and that predictability helped ports plan for arrivals, storage, and onward shipment. Port cities became the main places where this new economy came together. They were not only endpoints, they were commercial meeting grounds where goods were unloaded, inspected, taxed, stored, resold, and sent onward. A merchant might ship silk or porcelain from one port, receive spices or timber at another, and then move those goods into inland markets through rivers, roads, and intermediaries. Sea trade and land trade remained connected, but the center of gravity was shifting toward the coast. Cities with good harbors, stable administration, and access to wider markets grew in importance. In many regions, the prosperity of a port could matter as much as control of a distant pass. Archaeology and surviving administrative records from places such as Egyptian Red Sea ports, Persian Gulf harbors, and Chinese coastal centers show this pattern clearly. Warehouses, tax posts, docks, and merchant quarters became as important as caravanserais had been inland. States responded to this shift in different ways. Some tried to support seaborne trade through customs systems, naval protection, and port regulation. Others benefited indirectly because revenue from maritime commerce could strengthen local rulers and urban elites. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and later the South China Sea, political power increasingly followed shipping routes and harbor access. Control of a strait, a harbor, or a customs point could be more valuable than control of a remote inland trail. That was one of the practical strengths of sea power. It concentrated movement through places that could be taxed, defended, and supplied more efficiently than long desert crossings. In some cases, rulers invested in lighthouse systems, harbor improvements, and naval patrols. In others, they simply drew steady customs revenue from the traffic that passed through their ports. This shift also changed the risks merchants were willing to accept. Overland travel remained difficult because it depended on so many local arrangements. A caravan had to deal with weather, banditry, pasture access, tolls, and the politics of every region it crossed. Sea travel had dangers of its own, but in favorable seasons it could be faster and, for some goods, more economical. That made ocean routes especially attractive for high-volume trade and for networks linking far-reaching commercial communities. As maritime trade developed, merchants increasingly organized their business around ports, shipping schedules, and maritime partnerships rather than only around caravan chains. Credit, brokerage, and shared investment became easier to organize when ships could move large consignments between established harbors, even if the journey still depended on wind and season. The expansion of maritime exchange also worked alongside larger oceanic empires. These states did not create sea trade from nothing, but they often gave it a new shape. By controlling key coasts, ports, and maritime choke points, they could redirect traffic and draw revenue from commerce that crossed great distances. The result was not a single replacement for the Silk Road, but a gradual reordering of Eurasian exchange. Goods that once moved mainly along land corridors increasingly traveled by sea before moving inland again. The old routes remained in use, but they were no longer the main artery of long-distance trade in the same way. In many regions, inland routes became feeders to maritime systems rather than the primary channels of exchange themselves. By the time this change became clear, the Silk Road was no longer the dominant framework for Eurasian exchange that it had once been. It remained a set of important regional connections, but the broader balance had shifted. Even after sea routes became more important, the Silk Road did not disappear from history. It took on a second life, not as a single highway used every day, but as an idea later generations used to describe exchange across Eurasia. That idea was not ancient in its present form. It was shaped by historians, travelers, archaeologists, and modern states, each looking back at older routes and giving them new meaning. For many centuries, people along these routes did not usually think of themselves as living on the Silk Road. They knew specific passes, markets, caravan towns, and political borders. Chinese sources named Western regions in their own terms. Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, Greek, and later European writers described kingdoms, merchants, and pilgrimage routes in the language of their own worlds. The modern phrase Silk Road came much later. It was popularized in the 19th century by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, who used it for the broad network of overland exchange between China and the West. The term gave a common name to many separate routes, but it also simplified a much more complex history. That simplification mattered. Once the term entered scholarly use, it helped readers think of Eurasia as a connected space rather than a set of isolated civilizations. Historians could trace how goods, religions, technologies, and stories moved through Central Asia over long periods. Archaeology then added material evidence that made those connections easier to see. Excavations in oasis towns, desert tombs, and ruined monasteries produced textiles, coins, manuscripts, ceramics, wall paintings, and everyday objects from many regions. These finds showed that exchange was not a vague legend. It left physical traces in places that had once seemed remote. Some of the strongest evidence came from the Tarim Basin and the broader desert edges of Central Asia, where dry conditions preserved organic materials unusually well. Manuscripts in different languages, foreign coins, imported goods, and painted figures in mixed artistic styles all showed how local communities participated in wider networks. Archaeologists did not uncover one perfect route map, because the Silk Road was never that simple. What they found instead was a landscape of contact, towns, shrines, workshops, and caravan stops that changed over time as power shifted around them. That evidence supported the modern view that the Silk Road was not one road but a system of related connections. Travel writers helped make that system visible to a wider public. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers and scholars from Europe, Russia, Japan, and China traveled through Central Asia, often documenting ruins, manuscripts, and murals that had been neglected or buried. Their work sometimes reflected imperial rivalry and unequal access to local heritage, so it needs to be read carefully. But it also produced reports, photographs, maps, and collections that shaped modern knowledge of the region. Some travelers described the ruins in romantic language, while others recorded them in careful detail. In either case, their observations added to a growing picture of a long-distance world that had once tied together very different societies. Modern nations later took up the Silk Road in another way. As China, the Central Asian republics, India, Iran, Turkey, and other states developed modern historical identities, the old routes became useful as symbols. They could represent openness, exchange, and civilizational depth. Governments used Silk Road imagery in museums, textbooks, tourism campaigns, and diplomatic language. That use of the past has often been selective. It can emphasize cooperation while leaving aside conflict, conquest, inequality, and the fact that many people on these routes lived under hardship rather than harmony. Still, the appeal of the idea is easy to understand. It offers a way to describe shared history across a vast region without forcing every society into a single national story. International scholarship also helped stabilize the term. Historians increasingly treated the Silk Road as a framework for studying networks rather than a narrow trade line. They looked at horse exchange, frontier policy, monastic travel, disease transmission, art history, and migration together. That broader approach made the routes seem less like a decorative backdrop and more like an active system shaping Eurasian development. It also encouraged comparison. Scholars could ask why some routes flourished in one century and faded in another, or how climate, empire, and local politics altered traffic between the oases. The term became a tool for asking better questions, even when the answers were uneven and local. A frontier town might prosper because a nearby kingdom protected the road, then decline when that protection ended. A monastery might receive manuscripts from several regions in one century and fall silent in the next. The larger pattern was real, but it was made of many smaller histories. The memory of the Silk Road also changed with political needs in the 20th century and after. Newly formed states and older empires alike sought historical depth, and the overland routes offered a past that seemed both ancient and international. Museums began arranging objects from distant regions side by side. Schoolbooks explained the movement of silk, spices, paper, and religions across the continent. Diplomatic speeches used the phrase to suggest continuity between old exchange and modern cooperation. In some settings, the Silk Road was presented as proof that long-distance contact had always been normal in Eurasia. In others, it became a reminder that borders had rarely prevented movement entirely, even when they made it difficult. This was not always a neutral process, because memory rarely is. But it did help keep the subject alive for audiences who might otherwise have seen Central Asia as a blank space between larger powers. In that sense, the Silk Road survived because it was adaptable. The physical routes changed, and so did the people who used them, but the pattern of connection remained important enough to be named and renamed by later generations. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Silk Road had come to mean more than ancient trade. It became a way of understanding how Eurasia developed through contact. That mattered because the routes carried not only goods but also techniques, beliefs, artistic forms, and practical habits, often in small steps that only become clear over long periods. Trade remained the most familiar part of the story. Silk moved westward, but it was never the only valuable cargo. Horses, paper spices, metalwork, glass, precious stones, ceramics, and textiles traveled in different directions depending on demand and supply. Some exchanges are directly attested in surviving records, while others are reconstructed from archaeology, customs lists, tomb finds, and changing styles. The key point is that no single region supplied everything it wanted. The road worked because different zones specialized in different things, and because merchants could turn distance into value. A caravan or river route linked several economies at once. Goods passed through many hands before reaching a final market, and each transfer added cost, risk, and profit. That is why the Silk Road was never one road in a narrow sense, but a changing network of routes, caravan cities, mountain passes, desert edges, and ports connecting inland Asia with the Mediterranean world. Religion followed a similar pattern of movement and adaptation. Buddhism spread from the Indian subcontinent into Central Asia and then into China, Korea, and Japan through a long process involving translators, patrons, monasteries, and pilgrims. Other traditions also moved along the network, including Manichaeism and forms of Christianity associated with the Church of the East. These faiths did not simply arrive unchanged. They were translated into local languages, explained through local categories, and adjusted to local politics. Manuscripts, cave paintings, inscriptions, and temple remains show that exchange was physical and local, leaving traces where people prayed, copied texts, and taught students. In oasis towns and frontier kingdoms, religious communities often depended on merchants for support and rulers for protection. That made them vulnerable when politics shifted, but it also helped them travel. A monastery, a translation workshop, or a community of believers could provide stability in regions where borders were uncertain. Technology and knowledge moved as well. Paper, first developed in China, gradually spread westward. Printing coinage practices, irrigation techniques, medical ideas, and metallurgical skills also traveled through different hands and regions. Some transfers are easier to document than others, and historians are cautious about simple one-way stories. Still, the broad pattern is clear. The Silk Road allowed useful methods to circulate alongside luxury goods. A technique that began in one workshop or monastery could, after many stages of adaptation, become part of daily life far away. This was especially true in places where artisans, scholars, and administrators met. A new writing material mattered not only to merchants but also to tax officials, religious communities, and court bureaucrats. Better water management could change settlement patterns. Better metallurgy could affect tools, ornament, and weapons. In that sense, the road moved the practical foundations of society, not only its visible treasures. Art offers some of the clearest evidence of this circulation. Motifs moved across objects before they moved into written history. A pattern on a textile might echo Iranian, Chinese, or steppe traditions. A mural in a cave monastery might combine Indian religious imagery with Central Asian clothing or Chinese landscape conventions. Coins, carvings, ceramics, and wall paintings all show that the road connected styles of seeing as well as places. In some cases, the evidence comes from preserved objects. In others, scholars infer influence through repeated forms and shared iconography. The result is a more careful picture of cultural blending than older accounts allowed. Decorative borders, animal figures, lotus forms, halo imagery, and composite garments appear in different combinations across the region, suggesting that artisans adapted familiar designs for new patrons and audiences. What looks local on the surface often has a longer history of contact underneath. That blending was not always peaceful or even. The Silk Road also carried war captives, refugees, envoys, and migrants. Empires rose and fell. Cities prospered and declined. Languages shifted. Yet even when political control changed, the habit of connection often remained. A route might weaken in one period and recover in another. A monastery could lose patronage and later be rebuilt. A market town might shrink, then regain importance if a different empire protected the same corridor. The network endured because it was flexible enough to survive repeated interruption. That is one reason historians now speak of the Silk Road as a long-term system rather than a fixed line. Different states tried to tax it, protect it, redirect it, or control it, but the demand for exchange kept reappearing wherever geography made movement possible. In that larger sense, the Silk Road shaped Eurasia by making contact routine. It reduced distance without erasing it. It let societies compare themselves to others, borrow what they needed, and define themselves partly through exchange. Many of the people who moved along it are known only through fragments, a shipment record, a tomb object, a traveler's note, a translated manuscript. But their collective activity changed how continents were linked. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the Silk Road was changing again. New powers rose across Eurasia, borders shifted, and maritime trade grew more important. Some overland routes declined as sea lanes carried more long-distance commerce. Others continued where governments kept roads and caravan paths secure enough for merchants. The Silk Road did not end at one moment. It narrowed, adapted, and survived in parts of Central Asia and nearby regions. For centuries, these routes linked empires, cities, monasteries, and markets. They carried silk, spices, ideas, techniques, and beliefs. What remained was not a single road, but a long pattern of exchange that made Eurasia more connected than before.